Welcome everyone to our first event of the spring semester. Happy that you would choose to spend your evening, at least part of it, with us. George Washington Forum's speaker series. I want to thank a few people, especially Cameron Dunbar, our program coordinator, who helps with everything that GWF does. Also want to thank OU Event Services and Brandon Logan of Cremedia for providing videography. I know Brandon's not here, but thank him anyway. So tonight's speaker, Dr. Jared Rubin, is professor of economics at Chapman University and co-director of the Institute for the Study of Religion, Economics, and Society. He holds a Ph.D. in economics from Stanford University and completed his undergraduate studies at the University of Virginia. So Dr. Rubin is a very prolific scholar whose work in economics spans the fields of religion, history, politics, psychology, and sociology, among many others. And he'll speak to us this evening on the remarkable but often underappreciated phenomenon, often referred to as the Great Enrichment. So for millennia, humans subsisted at a basic level when even the relatively rich and powerful could not afford or did not have access to most of today's conveniences. And we live in a time where we almost expect tomorrow to be better than today in all sorts of dimensions, right? We expect tomorrow to offer more conveniences, better technology, and the ability to do more with fewer resources. Now, of course, there are important caveats to those claims, but what happened? What led us to where we expect improvement on a regular basis? What led us to where a large proportion of us currently work in or plan to work in so-called creative fields? And by creative fields, I don't just mean the arts, but also those fields where we strive to find and solve problems that will make the world better tomorrow. Dr. Rubin's latest book and the subject of tonight's talk, co-authored with Mark Koyama, sheds light on these questions, and I look forward to learning more. Other notable works everyone should check out are Dr. Rubin's 2017 book, Rulers, Religion, and Riches, Why the West Got Rich and the Middle East Did Not. It won some pretty prestigious prizes, the Lyndon Williamson Prize for Outstanding Book in Global, African, Asian, Australian, and/or South American Economic History, awarded by the Economic History Association. Also the winner of the Douglas North Best Book Award from the Society of Institutional Organizational Economics. And as a forthcoming book in the works, I'm guessing the working title may be different now since we had a chance to talk, but it was at one point titled How Rulers Rule, Political Legitimacy, the Creation of Constitutional Governance, and the Persistence of Autocracy, and many, many other journal articles, edited volumes, book chapters, and it's just astounding the amount of work he's done. Please help me welcome tonight's guest, Dr. Jared Rubin.
All right, well, yeah, thank you, Court, for inviting me and for the forum. This is, yeah, it's been really eye-opening to see what is being done here, and yeah, I just wanted to start by saying, especially to the students and the students that are associated with the George Washington Forum, don't take this for granted. This is a pretty special thing that is going on here in terms of really bringing people from different disciplines together, thinking through big questions that you really don't get at a lot of universities. So really, I mean, and this is obviously, this is a type of big question. I know that there's several others that are studied and you have readings and discuss them. This is something that, while I wouldn't say, it's 100% unique in that there are other places to do it, there are not a lot of other places that do it. So I really applaud this and I've loved learning about it. Now, to the book. To the big question. So when I was an undergraduate, I did my undergraduate in economics and math as well. And I just happened to stumble on an economics course my first year of undergraduate, and I really liked the way that economists thought about things, but this was really the question in the back of my mind that I'd always kind of just been interested in, and actually even, in high school would, pick up things here and there, and definitely in college, but never really thought, you'd be able to study it. Then you start to see, all right, well, economists can say something about this, and not just say something about it, it's really think about, well, how do we use history to understand these questions? History is another thing that I've always been interested in bringing these together to really answer what I think are among the biggest questions, not just for our own historical interests, but really to, when we think about why are some of us, for those of you in the room, especially for the students that are economics majors or maybe minors or take courses, I think this is one of the big questions that we want to understand. And for me at least, I want to understand it because I think, obviously there's still billions of people who, by modern standards, are not rich. So understanding what this process is might be able to help us, and even though previewing some of the stuff here, there's no silver bullet to becoming rich for a society to become what we're going to talk about as rich here, and I'm going to define what we mean by that in a second. But this is the question, I think, and I, like as in Courtney's comments, I want to caveat a couple things. This is very much meant to be a book of positive economics. And by positive here, I mean positive as opposed to normative, meaning we're trying to understand what happened. Yes, I mean, in the end, both Mark and I certainly do think that economic growth is a good thing, and it's a good thing not in and of itself, but because it really can alleviate poverty. I mean, so I'm a little over 40 years old. In my lifetime, there have been billions of people that have been lifted out of abject poverty, type of stuff Court was talking about in his opening remarks, to a place where, I think by US standards, we would not consider a comfortable life by any means, but by world historical standards, an extremely comfortable life. This is arguably, and I would say the biggest achievement that humanity has accomplished in my lifetime. Well, a good fraction of this is about 1 billion Chinese being lifted out of poverty, but there's been plenty of other, it's not by any means just China. Understanding this process, I think, is one of the key things to understand, not just in economics, not just the social sciences, but really it's one of the big questions for political leaders, for policymakers, it's like this, to really understand why this is the case. So the question I think we might be getting to wonder. So, as I just mentioned, there's still at least 1 billion people that are in abject poverty. There are many, many more even that you would say, are, while not in abject poverty, living on just a few dollars a day, are still by no means rich by what you or I might consider, by US standards, rich. But I think we can answer that question as yes. So we have to redefine, and in part this is, we wanted a provocative title, not just to sell books, but to really make people think about the questions at hand. So I think, how the world became rich is, all right, well, are we really rich? Yeah, I think we are. So here's one way to think about it. We have several figures like this at the beginning of the book. I'll just present a few to you. So the lighter shade countries here are countries that were richer in terms of annual per capita income. This is all in real terms, inflation adjusted, things like that, than Great Britain was. And Great Britain, to be clear, was the wealthiest country in the world in 1800. So as you can see, with the exception of a few countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, North Korea, and a couple others, every country right now in the world, with a few exceptions, is wealthier than the wealthiest country in the world was 200 years ago. We have another map that shows the relative to the US in 1900. The US, in terms of per capita GDP, was the wealthiest. A few more countries show up as a darker shade here, but still, most of the countries would be in a light shade. Again, meaning that in the span of just 200, 100 years, which in the grand scheme of humanity is not that long, even what we think of as some relatively poor countries today were wealthier than the wealthiest country in the world not that long ago. Again, these are just some metrics. I will show you more. So this would be another one. Now we're moving away from what we might think of as abject poverty. So we think of abject poverty today as around $3, $4 a day, which is really low, of course, per capita GDP. That's it's about $1,000 to $1,500 of per capita GDP. That's really where one is at societies around subsistence. Let's go above this. Let's go to, say, $10 a day. Again, far from what you would think of as a wealthy person in not just the US, but in the rich world. It's $3,650 a year of income. It's not much, but to be clear, if you make $3,650 a year you are I think you could probably claim a top 1% or definitely a top 2% in the world history of income distribution. To be very clear, making $10 a day would have been something that only a small slice of humanity would have ever made prior to 1800. Right? So getting to that point is, again, something where there is a fundamental divide between what happened in the beginning in the middle, early to mid 19th century, and certainly into the 20th century, beginning in what we now think of as the rich world, and now spreading to other parts of the world that we don't even necessarily think of as rich, but by world historical standards are incredibly rich. Any country on here that is not in the darkest shade has never reached $10 a day, is wealthier by far than any country that existed prior to, say, 1800. All right? Of course, there were wealthy people. Obviously, there was amazing architecture. There were things that took wealth. That was, in world history, this would have been very, very siloed into a very small portion of people. Most people in the world wouldn't have ever been anywhere close to this. And if you look at median, too, it's not that much different than this. So this is not just to say, what we're seeing up here is not being driven by a few billionaires in these countries. This is very much a median phenomenon as much as it is a mean, okay? Now, I think this is the one that is, it's one of the most famous figures in all of economics. It's what is known in economic history, at least, as the hockey stick graph, because it looks like a hockey stick on its side. This is a figure that shows you, again, and I want to be clear, these are very noisy estimates. We don't actually know what GDP looked like in the year 1. In any place, but we do have ways of estimating, based on historical records, based on what we know about, how many people were living in areas, what type of diets they might have had, things like this. So we shouldn't, I just want to preface this by saying some of this stuff we should take with a bit of a grain of salt, but the overall theme of this figure is not that controversial. What we see here is per capita income across the world over, say, the last 2,000 or so years, broken down by region. As you can see, up until the second, third decade of the 19th century, most places were right around subsistence. Now, right around subsistence would put you at about, again, $1,000 to $2,000, maybe $1,000 to $1,500 of per capita income per year. Again, that's in modern day dollars. There's a takeoff that happens. It first happens in Britain, and then it quickly spreads to some other parts of Western Europe and North America. And then you might be able to see, even though it gets all jumbled in the 20th century, other parts of the world start to catch up. Some have been, of course, much slower to catch up. But the point here is that there was something fundamental that happened in around the 19th century that has allowed us to really be, by all world standards, rich. Now, most people in this room, even those of us whose families are by no means wealthy in the U.S. context, most people in the U.S. are actually wealthy by world context in 2024, right? If you then think about not just in the world context, but the history of the world, every person who has lived since Homo sapiens became a person or became a thing, or really even you could go much more recently than that, ever since humans settled down in the Neolithic period, maybe 8,000 to 10,000 years ago in different parts of the world, we're almost certainly all in the top 1%, right? And that's something that is a function of what happened 150 to 200 years ago that, again, eventually spread to different parts of the world. And now most people that are living today are in that top, say, 5 to 10% of people that of at least income that has ever existed in the last 8 to 10,000 years. Let me go back one slide first. So what we do in this book is say, all right, there are 5 major sets of explanations out there in the literature on what we might call the deep roots of why the world became rich. Because this is something that requires a historical explanation. All right, it's something that happened in the 19th century, but it didn't just happen randomly in Britain, right? There's a reason it happened when and where it did. Now, and I shouldn't say there's a reason. There are many reasons, and there are also many reasons why it didn't happen in other places. If you looked in the year, even as late as, say, 1000, right? This is approximately 750 years before Britain really begins its Industrial Revolution, Britain would have been one of the last places in Eurasia that you would have expected an industrial revolution to happen 750 years later. If you told somebody living in the year 1000 that for some reason had a great deal of knowledge about every civilization in the world, in 750 years, there's going to be a takeoff in which that starts a process by which the world's just going to become much, much richer. And not just the elites, but most people will have access to basic comforts, no real fear of starvation, things like this. Again, now within Eurasia, Britain would have been one of the very last places you would have expected. So this is definitely part of the question: is why did the takeoff happen in, we'll call it northwestern Europe, because there were some things that were happening in the modern day Netherlands as well. All right, why didn't it happen in a place like China, which certainly in the year 1000 probably would have been the best guess, maybe the Middle East as well. All right, so these are all questions that we have to grapple with. And really in the back of our minds, what Mark and I were trying to do in this book is also, we first wanted to just lay out what are the main theories as value-free as we could be, and then say, all right, now what can we learn from these main theories into what actually did happen in Britain in the 18th century, and then into the 19th century, and then how it spread to places like, again, the US, and then eventually in the 20th century spread to places, especially in East Asia. So the first set of theses have to do with geography. And before I really even get into some of the bigger theories on geography, I should say a couple things. First off, this is 2 to 3 years at least of our life that I'm trying to condense in 45 minutes. So yeah, I'm obviously going to have to skip over quite a bit. So I'll happily answer anything in the Q&A. But when it comes to all of these 5 major types of theses, I think one thing that I will hopefully reiterate as we go on here is that there are no silver bullets. It's not just going to be geography. It's not just going to be any of the other 4 things I say. Oftentimes, it's a mixture of things that really matters. And one thing I think we need to keep in mind is that context is really specific. What worked in Britain might not work elsewhere because it's a different context. That doesn't mean, however, that understanding what happened in Britain and then what happened in the US and what happened in Belgium or wherever else, it's a lost cause. It doesn't mean it's a lost cause to understand this stuff because it can only have happened the way it happened. We still want to have an idea for the menu of things that might lead to some places to be economically successful, and also the menu of things that might have held societies that were otherwise primed for success back. Those things are important to at least begin to understand and the type of question I'm most interested in is the parts of the world that aren't currently wealthy, or even people within some of those societies that are a little wealthier but are still being held behind. How do we alleviate this the human suffering that might be associated with this? All right. So when we're talking about geography, really, there are aspects of geography which can improve economic fortunes. So, a big one, so there's climatic conditions. Being near coasts really, has helped historically because, it really helps with trade, being near navigable rivers, things like this. There are also aspects of geography, and I'm just going to point to a couple here, that can hold societies back. So, sub-Saharan Africa has this malaria belt. There's also, in a very similar regions, they're susceptible to the tsetse fly, which causes sleeping sickness. Now, what these types of diseases have historically done are twofold. One is that obviously, it kills people, it slows productivity, things like this, which, just from the human element, really make certain types of economic activities difficult. Another thing it does is it also kills livestock. And what this means is that the way that the economies, and especially the agricultural economies of sub-Saharan Africa have grown, have been much different than other parts, especially, the comparison group is largely going to be Eurasia here, because Eurasia is where most of the world's economic frontier has been historically. When we're talking about domesticated animals, in particular, that can not just be used for proteins, but also for plowing fields and things like this, when many of them are dying from disease, obviously they become of much less use. So this would be a geographical condition that does impinge on economic development. All right. Another one, which was made famous by Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel, is the shape of continents. So his thesis, which is not real, he just popularized, I should say, is that whether a continent is kind of more north-south or east-west matters. And the reason it matters is north-south, when the axis is north-south, as it is in the Americas, and as it is in, we'll say sub-Saharan Africa for the most part. Northern Africa is more or less east-west, and it's really connected to Eurasia via the Mediterranean. But sub-Saharan Africa and the Americas are much more north-south. And what that means is that moving from moving across say the Americas or sub-Saharan Africa, you're moving across a lot of different climatic conditions. What that means is that things like agriculture, new crop varieties. Historically, the biggest innovations for pretty obvious reasons, all came in agriculture. A lot of it had to do with crop varieties that might have been more productive for the most part, or just new crops as a whole. They're much less likely to diffuse north-south because it very much matters the type of soil conditions, the type of climate for those things to diffuse in the first place. This also means that ideas are slower to diffuse because people are less likely to diffuse. Whereas Eurasia is much more east-west. Now, of course, there are different climates in Eurasia. South China has a very different climate than, say, North Germany. But for the most part, it is an east-west axis, which means that there are fewer changes and fewer dramatic changes in climatic conditions. So you might expect that things like ideas, which are really important for economic growth, but also new innovations, are much more likely to spread on this east-west plane. And this has recently received some empirical support by these data sets that look at technology adoption. So where has technology been adopted historically? And you can see, so the darker areas up here are places that have the highest level of technology adoption in 1500. So when we're looking at a lot of this stuff, the Columbian Exchange that begins with Europeans conquering the Americas really does change stuff, but this is, we'll say prior to this really happening, we see that more or less all of the places that are on the technology frontier are in Eurasia and North Africa. Again, North Africa is connected along the Mediterranean. This is, again, empirical support for this idea that it's the east-west flow that really allows for not just technology, but the spread of technology. And really, prior to 1500, most of that technology is flowing east to west. So a lot of it so China is certainly for about 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire is the primary place where technology is being created. A lot of it eventually makes its way west, but it's all on this east-west gradient. All right. These are just a few examples. There's many more that we can maybe discuss if you're interested in, or if you read the book. The second one that we go into, which there's been a really booming literature on in the last 30 years, and this is actually one of the places where both Mark and I have done most of our own research on, is on institutions. So institutions we should think about as those features of society that formulate, to use the Nobel Prize winner Douglas North's terminology, the rules of the game. It's the incentives that we face in our everyday lives. So this could be political institutions, legal institutions, religious institutions, all of which, they don't dictate the types of actions we take, but they incentivize us, right? Laws incentivize us to not act or maybe to act in certain ways. It doesn't mean we do so, but it does mean that the costs and benefits shift based on a society's institutions. Now, one thing about geographical explanations, which are attractive, I think, both to social scientists but also non-social scientists, is that to use just a little bit of social science language, is they're exogenous, right? The types of things we're trying to understand, namely why certain parts of the world became rich, did not cause geography, right? If anything, certain geographical endowments might have caused certain parts of the world to either become wealthy or not. Institutions aren't like this, right? Because on the one hand, we might say certain types of institutions, and I'll discuss this in a second, might have contributed to certain parts of the world becoming wealthy and others not. And this is something that is attractive about institutions, is that different societies have very, very different institutions. So they might be of first order importance. On the other hand, it's also possible that as societies grow wealthier, they might get better institutions, right? So disentangling the direction of causation, and I'm going to show you in a second some correlations, but underlying all these correlations are economic arguments why these correlations are causal. Hopefully, we're all, we're at a university. Hopefully, we know that when we see correlations, we should not immediately assume that those correlations are causal. But what I will be telling you here is a lot of the correlations I will be showing you come from mostly academic papers, which make pretty strong causal arguments based on not just the correlational data. So I'm not going to show you a ton of words here. Most of these slides are figures. But I felt like it was necessary to give you some examples of what types of institutions. So institutions that protect property rights are something that has been shown time and time again to really contribute. Now, again, none of these are silver bullets. I also want to be very clear. There's nothing that is a silver bullet. But the more of these bullets, maybe for a terrible analogy, you amass, the better off societies typically are. So those that protect property rights, for instance, really contribute to investment. They contribute to entrepreneurship, things that we do think of at least as among the maybe not deeper roots, but maybe kind of more proximate roots of economic growth. As you see on the left here, the type of economic institutions that economists and political scientists and economic historians typically look at are those that facilitate market activity. Now, we shouldn't take this too far. Now, we know that, that markets can produce negative externalities, and this would also be part of this as well. Those types of institutions that reduce pollution or reduce monopolistic power, things like this, can also contribute to economic growth, for sure. And the last one, having mobile labor markets. So if you look at medieval Europe, for instance, labor wasn't mobile. If you were a peasant, you were more or less tied to the land, even if there was better economic opportunities elsewhere. This is something that is important for human well-being, the ability to leave when you're not being treated well or not being paid your contribution to the product. Now, probably the bigger one, though, and actually this kind of helps support economic institutions, are political institutions. This is something that there's now a very large literature in economics and political science which suggests that political institutions and differences across societies in political institutions really has a significant amount of explanatory power in differences in economic development. Now, when I teach this, not just this book, but when I teach economic growth or economic history in general, I often use an analogy of an onion. So we can think of the outside of the onion as being economic growth or economic stagnation, depending on the society. We say, all right, well, maybe what's the most proximate cause, right? Maybe it's institutions, something like this, good institutions leading to either, technology transfers or things like this, the types of things that we think of as being proximate. We can then say, all right, well, why do some societies, have good institutions or good from the context of, in the context of economic growth versus other societies? That's a question that I'm not going to answer here, but I'll hopefully we'll either get to in the Q&A. The book definitely tries to get at this. So we should say, that these political institutions that protect political rights, that maybe place constraints on executive power, so movements away from autocracy, movements away from dictatorship. These don't just come out of the ether, of course. There are historical reasons why some societies, there's cultural reasons why some societies might be more prone to have these types of institutions versus other. But this is where understanding history and reading history and knowing why these certain societies were able to have these types of transformations really matters. All right, and I mean, you could almost certainly, I think, probably think off the top of your head at least 5 more types of political or economic institutions that might matter for economic growth. We certainly discuss many more in the book. These are just a few examples. One is the rule of law. So this is something where political scientists are very good at making metrics to try to put some quantification on things we think of as important. So rule of law being the idea that no one is above the law, that the law applies equally to everyone, that there is that there is law that is that is codified, that is again applicable to everyone, that elites do not get special treatment, or and we should say that in reality there is no society really ever that has had perfect rule of law, in that in almost anywhere, if you're wealthy, you would have access to things that might help you win a court case, say, that people without that type of wealth might not be able to have. Clearly in the US, there can be racial differences in adjudication. That said, though, just because no country has ever had a perfect rule of law, we can say that it varies. And we should say, all right, well, let's think about what this variation looks like, and think about, might this contribute to economic growth? Now, here's a plot. Hopefully you should be able to see this. The horizontal axis is an index created by political scientists that at the country level for the rule of law. The higher the number, the stronger the rule of law. And the vertical axis is just per capita GDP. And you don't need a trend line there to see that this is very highly correlated in a positive way. Again, I want to caution, of course, correlation does not equal causation, but there have been a slew of economic papers that make a very strong case that at least at the most proximate level, this is a causal relationship. And I should also say that even when I say causal here, this does not necessarily imply that if you just strengthen a society's rule of law, you get an increase in per capita GDP. There are a whole host of things that feed into that, what makes a country wealthy. This is one of them. And more so, you could say it's much less likely that a society is going to grow above a certain level if the rule of law is really, really weak. All right, and you can see this, this is really the same data across, but mapping it out. You can kind of see, so lighter countries here, so lighter shaded countries have stronger rule of law. The most darkly shaded countries have weaker rule of law. I think this is broadly consistent with what you'd expect it to look like, in terms of both, not just political institutions, but really, this correlation, again, with wealth, with GDP per capita, with income. All right. Another related score is what is known as the polity score. The polity score looks at, it's kind of a range that on the one hand is pure autocracy, where, it's essentially one or a very small group of people that are more or less dictators of a country, to the far other end where it's, the most ideal that we at least have democracy, and then there's a lot in the middle. In fact, the US's polity score has gone down for really about the first time ever in the last 5 or so years. So you can see the US is actually not even the most lightly shaded here. Now again, I think that one reason I include this map, even though it has a lot of overlap with what I just showed you on the rule of law, is to also show you that there are outliers. This is not something where this explains it perfectly. I mean, so look at, say, Mongolia and India have better polity scores than the U.S. Clearly, much less wealthy. So this is not to say, again, that this is everything. On the other hand, the correlation is, again, very strong. And what we know, and what all Mark and I were trying to do with this part of the book, is lay out all the theories. We try to do it in as objective way as possible. We have our own thoughts. I mean, we have our own research, of course, which does suggest that maybe some things are more important than others. But all we're trying to do now is show you some of the key features. Now, one way economists try to gain causation, there's several, call econometric ways. One way, though, is we look in history and look for natural experiments. Say, all right, something happened at a certain time. And natural experiments are rarely clean, and the one I'll describe in a second is not completely clean. But what we might want to see is, all right, something happened in history in a society that had very similar culture, maybe very similar geographic endowments. So all these things that we might think of as affecting institutions are actually very similar, but something happened and made their institutions diverge, and then we see economic divergence as well. And that would be the case with the Korean Peninsula. So after the Korean War, the Korean Peninsula was one of the poorest places in the world. Per capita GDP was around $2 or so a day in both the South and the North. If anything, the North was a little wealthier. And then they got very, very different political institutions, which obviously then bled into different cultures emerging over time. But one thing we see is that, it's really undeniable what happened in terms of the economic growth of the two regions. Now, both did have dictatorships after the Korean War, but there was a much more market-oriented focus in the South that came about, and eventually dictatorship went away. And this shows you nightlights, which are a way that economists and social scientists now are able to kind of on a more micro level get some degree of economic activity, an understanding and a quantification of economic activity, because where you have nightlights, you have more economic activity, you have more urbanization, you have all of the things that you think of, and we can see this from the, from satellite images. North Korea actually, it looks like it's just the sea there, but it's not. That's just a country that would be very, very poor. You see, just a small little bit of light here and there, whereas you can clearly see where Seoul is and, several other major cities that are. Again, this is just where economic activity is happening. This is the type of thing that we can use and then to really at least argue for some type of causation in the case of the Korean Peninsula. And as we build more and more and more of these arguments for different parts of the world, we start to see that institutions probably really do matter for economic growth. All right, so the next set of explanations are cultural. And this is a minefield, to be very clear. About in the early 20th century, economists, this was kind of the formation of some of the social sciences, were often very, say, Eurocentric at best, maybe racist at worst, in their cultural explanations of why Europe seemed to be so much better off. Oh, it's just something about Europe's having some superior form of culture, or maybe something about Christianity, or as we'll see in a second, maybe aspects of Protestantism that were just more conducive to economic growth. And again, a lot of these really bordered on, or maybe just were straight up racist. And for that reason, in the mid-20th century, a lot of these explanations, especially within economics, kind of went away. Probably though to some detriment, in that not that the racist comments were to the detriment, but the idea that culture didn't matter at all for understanding economic growth, economic development. This is kind of what the neoclassical model that became very popular in the 20th century would suggest, has been challenged in the last 20 to 30 years. And what the focus has moved more towards is kind of culture as it's defined by cultural anthropologists, who view culture as the commonly shared lens through which people view the world. Do we trust each other? Do we trust outsiders? These are things that are really cultural in nature, but I'll show you some data on trust in a second. Trust, we know, and this is not at all controversial among economists, is one of the more important features of making markets work, even. Think about, on the one hand, you say, all right, well, do I really need to trust that a company or, somebody selling me something's going to not cheat me because I can always go, sue them or something? Yeah, if it's a big type of transaction, we can sign contracts and things like this. But most of the transactions you engage with on a day-to-day basis do not require contracts, and in fact, they're of so low value that you wouldn't sue over them. So there has to be some degree of trust that when we engage, think about especially more informal stuff, like if you buy something on like Facebook Marketplace, or now I'm dating myself, Craigslist or something like this, where you would just engage with somebody, they could really run off with the goods, and you would have very little recourse. The only reason things like that can exist is that there has to be some degree of trust, and this is a cultural phenomenon. These types of transactions would not be able to occur in certain parts of the world where trust is lower. All right, now what do we mean? Now culture can take many forms. One of them, so one that has been, and this is my own research as well, that has been looked at a lot is religion. So this is a simple figure which kind of gets at one of the real first attempts at understanding why the world became rich is from the very well-known economist co-founder of sociology in some forms, Max Weber, who put forth the idea that the Protestants had some type of ethic that made them different from everyone else. This was this idea that there was this Calvinist notion of predestination. People wanted to show that they were part of the elect, and to show that you were going to be predestined to go, you had earthly success. That was Weber's idea. To be very clear, it has been scrutinized for the last century, and most of the pushback is pretty suggestive that to the extent that Protestants have been better off, it's probably not due to a superior work ethic. But he was also onto something, at least in terms of correlation. I think the Weber's hypothesis is a great example of there being potentially correlations, but getting the causation wrong. And that really, since the Reformation, the world's leading economy has been a predominantly Protestant state. So soon after the Dutch broke free of Spanish rule in the late 16th century, they became the world's leading economy. They were Protestant for about 150 years, followed by the British, followed by the US. Okay, what this shows, again, is something, this is now, this figure up here, correlational. I'm not making a causal claim at all on here, even though there have been, I think, somewhat convincing aspects of the literature that shows why this might be causal. And to be clear, even before I say what this is, there's the convincing arguments in the literature. It's not something about Protestantism. It's not something about Islam. It's often about institutions associated with religion. So what this shows is that there's a positive correlation, even though not incredibly strong, between the fraction Protestant in the country, the fraction Catholic in the country, and per capita GDP, and there's a negative, though not incredibly strong, correlation between the fraction Muslim and the per capita GDP. Again, though, this is the type of thing where there is a large literature that suggests that there might be causal elements to this, and we should think about what that means. Now, one reason that culture more generally, not just religion, is so important and as a potential explanation is that it tends to persist. All right, when culture emerges in a certain time period for a certain reason, it can persist long after that reason has gone. Now, kind of the classic example of this is the difference, a whole host of differences between northern and southern Italy. Now, there's been a lot of social science research trying to understand this. If you look at any type of map which shows economic or political outcomes broken down by region in Italy, they almost all look like this, where you can see a real sharp divide between the South and the North. Now, I think the leading economic and political science theories would suggest that this has to do in large part with the way medieval politics were structured. In the North, you have a lot of the growth. This is the period of the growth of city-states, which had a great deal of independence. They were economic hubs, and in fact, northern Italy, it was, along with the Low Countries, was the wealthiest part of Europe for centuries in the late medieval period, whereas the South was dominated by various empires, including the Spanish, including in parts of southern Italy by Muslim empires. And these types of kind of the economic things like free association, market activity, political constraints really didn't exist. And what we end up seeing are things, so these are three different examples of first cousin marriage, trust, judicial efficiency, three very different types of things. And judicial efficiency is more of an institutional thing, but it has a lot to do with culture as well. If there's a culture of expectation that the court system will be efficient, then you end up getting relatively efficient judiciary. These are things that you can see. I mean, you can eyeball this and see that there's a stark divide. The idea here is that all of these things came about in a period where the reason they came about, these cultural elements came about, has nothing to do with anything that's still relevant today, but these cultural elements still tend to persist. All right, last one, because I've already mentioned trust. This is something where economists both view trust as being quite important for a whole host of economic outcomes, but we also have good data on trust because it's asked in all types of surveys, including the World Values Survey. So on the horizontal axis here, you see something that says most people can be trusted. On the vertical axis, you have per capita GDP, obviously a high positive correlation. All right, I'm realizing I need to move on a little bit. So a fourth explanation has to do with demography. So we just call this fewer babies, because perhaps the most famous explanation of world economic history prior to recent was the Malthusian model, which, ironically enough, Thomas Malthus came up with this thesis in about 1798, just as Britain was industrializing, and soon thereafter, his thesis would kind of not so longer hold water, but they actually do a decent job at explaining world economic history up to the point he was living. Basic idea is that most people in world history, and there's not a ton of controversy about this, live near subsistence. Now, why was this the case? You would get occasional one-off technological advances on the positive side, or on the negative side, stuff like the plague, stuff that killed a lot of people, but would have, for those who survived, positive economic benefits in that, now you have much lower population that can serve in the labor market, so you get higher wages. Why doesn't that persist? Well, if those technological advances, things like that, are not persistent, eventually people just have more kids. And those more mouths eat up all the extra gains. So what you end up getting is a greater population, but per capita GDP tends to be about the same. All right, and this does a very good job, for the most part, at explaining pre-1800 world economic history. In fact, there are still parts of the world today which we would consider Malthusian. This gives you an example here of showing you population just in England and wages over 5.5 centuries. And you can see, you just eyeball this, very obviously a negative correlation between the two. So when you have population growth, it drives down wages. Again, there are labor markets at work, but this is the idea that you have stuff like this massive population drop in the 14th century due to the plague that actually continues over the next few centuries in spouts. And that does raise wages. Eventually, though, England repopulates, and it's only when you get persistent technological advance that can outpace demographic trends that you actually get growth in wages and a rising living standard. And what we do see is we do see that today. So we've clearly, to some degree, solved this. This is, I think, a figure of real hope in the sense that the country in the world today with the worst life expectancy, the lowest life expectancy, at least as of these data, was Zimbabwe, which is at 53 years. Now, in 1800, the life expectancy in Great Britain was 38 years. Again, that's the wealthiest country in the world. So now the poorest country, or the country with the lowest life expectancy, has a much higher life expectancy than just a couple hundred years ago, the country with the greatest life expectancy. Clearly, we've made significant strides on the demographic front and have been able to do so while also becoming richer. So that throws into question whether the Malthusian model, and it clearly does not explain the modern world, how did we get there? Last one we'll do, and then I'll have some comments on how we think about this, and then we can open it up for Q&A, is colonization. So on the one hand, and I won't even really go, so there's two aspects to these types of discussions. One is, what degree did colonization play in, say, Britain's industrialization or European growth? On this front, the evidence is incredibly mixed. There are a lot of scholars on both sides that I think have made convincing cases for why colonization did matter for European growth, and particularly British growth, and why it didn't. Why maybe the Industrial Revolution would have happened, but maybe in a slightly different way had there not been colonization. What is much less, and I'll just put this up here now, what is much less controversial is what happened to the colonized. Because when we ask the question, how did the world become rich, the converse of that question is also part of the question. Why didn't certain parts of the world become rich? As you can see here, much of the world, the landmass of the world, was colonized just by those countries in the darkest shade. Right? The countries in the medium shade there were the colonized world, again, just by that little swath of Western Europe. If you added, say, Russia to this list, there would be a lot more of the world looking colonized. Now, again, I need to move on, so I'll just kind of go over maybe the most obvious case of where colonization really for centuries has harmed, and well beyond the colonial period, has harmed economic growth, is the slave trade. There's been a lot of real recent empirical work that suggests, not surprisingly, the slave trade harmed Africa's economic development, but has really shown some mechanisms through which this has happened too. So trust in societies in which more slaves were taken from is still much lower. Per capita GDP in those societies where more slaves were taken is still much, much lower. And here you see the places, actually it's the lighter shades where more slaves were taken from the transatlantic slave trade. And here you see that there's a clear negative relationship, this is from the work of Nathan Nunn, that shows on the horizontal axis the number, and it's a very unfortunate term that literature uses, slave exports. It's the number of slaves that were taken from the society, and on the vertical axis is per capita GDP. It's a very, very clear negative correlation. Again, that persists to today. And it's actually even growing. So over time, we want to say, look, even if sub-Saharan Africa does have some bad, there's many places that have bad institutions, like, very autocratic governance. That's far from the only reason that we see these types of correlations. And in fact, we have plenty of causal reason to think that colonization might have had a negative impact on the prospects of sub-Saharan Africa. So that was part one. I'm going to go over part two much quicker because that gives you the meat of the book. We then get into the history. And the history has to begin with Britain because Britain was the first place that industrialized where a lot of the takeoff happens. Even prior to the takeoff, we start to see there was a little divergence. So there's a great divergence. That's a term by the historian Ken Pomerantz, but that he was looking at China versus Western Europe. That was happening prior to industrialization. So you see Western Europe diverging certainly from, say, in this case, Japan and India, and to some extent China, even prior to industrialization. But even within Western Europe, prior to industrialization. So Britain doesn't just take off from a point of being behind. It had already moved a bit ahead of every place except the Netherlands, which I'll talk about in a second, prior to industrialization. So if you ask that person, well, it wouldn't be the same person unless they lived 700 years, but if you asked a different person in 1700, what would be a place that might take off in 50 years, then Britain would be a pretty good answer. All right? So there's a lot of preconditions for takeoff, and we build on the history that we go over in these previous chapters to really try to understand some of these conditions. So there's stuff like the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, that really changed the way people think. Because really, in the end, what industrialization is all about is technology. And it's increasing the rate of innovation. And the question is, why does this happen in a certain part of the world? And why didn't it happen before? Why didn't it happen in a different part of the world? All of these things matter. So when we talk about Britain's Industrial Revolution, this is a takeoff. And it's an undeniable takeoff on all margins. Now, wages are slow to lag. They lag behind. The reason that wages lag behind is you would initially get this massive takeoff in GDP. That's the most starkly rising figure here. The first thing that happens is Britain's population rises really rapidly. So that's what I described before as Malthusian. Eventually, though, the rate of technology is high enough that it starts to be seen in wage growth. And we see that that's the slowest one growing here, but we eventually see it growing. And if we were to extend this into the late 19th and into early 20th century, it rises much more dramatically. All right? It's the last point here that's the key one. What matters is that not that this growth happens, because growth happened in places in different periods of the world. Song China, Roman Empire, the Abbasid Empire in the Middle East. What happened in Great Britain, though, is that this growth became sustained, and then it spread to the rest of the world. In the last couple slides here, and then we'll open it up. One of the leading theories, and it's the one that I think Mark and I at least come down on as being having not full explanatory power, because there's no one individual theory that has full explanatory power, but really captures a lot of the essence of something that made Britain in particular a little different was what Moykier, Joel Moykier, who for my money is the leading scholar on the Industrial Revolution right now, the culture of growth. And what this idea is that there's this pan-European kind of enlightenment and kind of views on science in particular that view science as a way to progress human nature that is very different than anything else. To be clear, that's not unique to Britain by any means. This is something where, if anything, the French are probably, in some degrees, more on the vanguard. But these institutions that support it, like reliable postal system whereby these scholars could communicate with each other, and really science can build on itself, starts to become a thing again across Europe, but then it interacts with all of these other conditions that are unique to Britain. Some of these conditions being like a whole host of skilled craftsmen, different types of political institutions, which are much more constrained than they are in places like France, which is much more autocratic. So what we draw from this, and what this book draws from this, and I'll stop in a couple minutes here, is that it's really a host of factors that come together. And what by studying history we can do is see what those factors are that worked in specific contexts in the past and say, all right, well, this gives you a menu of things that might work. Now, if we really want to bring it to the present day, or even the more recent present day, we say, all right, well, what are the contexts that we're dealing with here? Let's think about what might work to help, to change the growth trajectory of these societies. If you're a policymaker, we're thinking, working either within those governments or in international organizations. Right? There's no silver bullet. What happened in Britain is very unlikely, in the 18th and 19th centuries, is very unlikely to be, it's impossible to replicate exactly, right? In fact, world trade is just so much different today than it was then that you would industrialize, or maybe not even industrialize today, in a very different way. But we do know that there's other elements than just purely economic ones that lead to economic growth, and that's really what this book has been about. All right, so we have the modern economy emerging. We have the second industrial revolution that happens in the late 19th century, which is actually ends up being more important for sustained economic growth, because what it does is it ties together science and technology. The reason this is important is science is a process that builds on itself. The works of some scholars then get improved upon or change the way others are thinking, and then when that actually marries into technology, the type of things that actually facilitate humans using the science, then that's when we really start to see a takeoff. And this is no longer just relegated to Britain. This is something the US is very much involved in, something Germany, something France. The countries that eventually become rich in this period are very much involved in. All right, I'll kind of skip over some of this. The US rises in this period. We see this in terms of industrial output. Right, this is just share of world industrial output. The dashed line there is the USA. And the US becomes really the world's economic power, both in industrial output and really every other metric, beginning in the early 20th century. Following, a lot of the same ways that Britain became a powerhouse earlier on, but with a slight twist, because culture was clearly a little different, even though not so much, because there was obviously British roots, but in a very different way. This was also, again, something unlike Britain was an immigrant-fueled expansion too. When we think about labor markets, this is one of the great stories of the 19th century U.S. This was a period of very, very high levels of immigration, and labor markets, for that reason, were just very different and allowed for different types of technologies to be diffused in different ways. Finally, maybe I'll kind of end here because I think I'm running out of time. One other thing that was also happening in this period that really mattered for this type of growth to be sustained was what was known as a demographic transition. People in the wealthier parts of the world start having fewer children. So now we have this combination of a very high rate of innovation, which allows technological progress to really sustain over time, and people having fewer kids. So those what we called before Malthusian pressures are no longer pushing up against growth, and that's this combination of events really allows for certain parts of the world to really take off. All right, again, when we're thinking about, maybe, and I'll end on this note, maybe I'll just end on this figure, which I think, is again, what I would consider, even though China obviously is very much an autocracy, a lot of the lessons that we've learned here happened in China, especially, with the rise of markets and things like this. This figure here is one of I think, the great human achievements of my lifetime. This figure here shows about a billion plus people being moved out of poverty, abject poverty. Now, there is still obviously poverty in China, but the most abject of poverty, living on $2, $3 a day, has largely been eradicated in China. Now, this has come with a host, and clearly not just in China, beginning in Britain, host of environmental degradation, climate change, stuff that obviously needs to be, is probably the most important human thing to think about in your generation, and I'm talking to students here, and as mine as well. There are very obvious costs to all of this, and obviously, if this ends up making the world uninhabitable, it's not worth it. And that's not the point of this book. The point of this book is not to say that growth should happen at any cost, by any means. It is to say, though, that when we think about stuff like inequality, when we think about why economics might be important, and understanding why societies grow, there really is an element of human suffering that might be able to be alleviated through this process. And I think for many of us, and certainly myself, this was the reason why I wanted to try to understand this stuff in the first place. And history tells us a lot about that process. All right, so I will leave it at that, and I think we'll hopefully have a little bit of time for Q&A. Thanks. Thanks.